They say when you hear a child's laughter echoing through empty halls in the Louisiana swamps, you run. Because little Chloe Woodruff has been waiting 2 centuries for someone to discover who murdered her, and tonight, her patience has finally run out. The humid Louisiana evening clung to Myrtle's plantation like a shroud, thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and something far more sinister. Judge David Bradford Woodruff stood in his study, staring at the oil painting of his beloved daughter Chloe that hung above the fireplace. 2 months had passed since her brutal murder, yet the pain felt as fresh as the night they found her broken body in the upstairs hallway. "Papa?" came a soft voice from the doorway. Sarah, his surviving daughter, entered with hesitant steps. At 21, she bore a striking resemblance to her murdered sister, though her eyes now held a haunted quality that had emerged since the tragedy. "I keep thinking I hear her," Judge Woodruff said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her laughter, her footsteps on the stairs. Sometimes I swear I can smell her lavender perfume." Sarah moved closer, her silk dress rustling in the oppressive silence. "The servants are talking, Papa. They say they've seen her, standing at the top of the stairs, just watching." "Nonsense," the judge said, but his voice lacked conviction. He had seen her too, a fleeting glimpse of golden hair and white dress in his peripheral vision, always vanishing when he turned to look directly. The plantation had been home to the Woodruff family for 3 generations, but since Chloe's death, it felt more like a tomb. The grand mansion, with its towering columns and sprawling verandas, had once been the crown jewel of Louisiana society. Now, guests declined invitations, and even the slaves whispered about the cursed house when they thought no one was listening. "The sheriff came by again today," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from her father. "He still has no leads about who killed her." Judge Woodruff's jaw tightened. The official investigation had yielded nothing but frustration. Chloe had been found at the top of the main staircase, her neck broken, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had been pushed. But there were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, no obvious motive. "There are rumors," Sarah continued carefully, "about the will, about Chloe's inheritance." The judge's eyes flashed dangerously. "What kind of rumors?" "People are saying that Chloe discovered something about the family business, that she was going to expose certain irregularities, that someone killed her to keep her quiet." "Idle gossip," Judge Woodruff snapped, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the evening's coolness. That's when they heard it. The sound of children's laughter echoing through the mansion's halls, but it wasn't joyful laughter. It was hollow echoing, tinged with something that made the blood run cold. Sarah grabbed her father's arm. "Did you hear that?" The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of small feet running across the hardwood floors above them. But both remaining Woodruff children were in the room, and there were no other children in the house. "Chloe?" Judge Woodruff called out, his voice cracking. "Is that you, my dear?" The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums. Then slowly, a child's voice drifted down from the 2nd floor. "Papa, why did you let them kill me?" The words hit Judge Woodruff like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face draining of color. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth in horror. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Chloe is dead. We buried her ourselves." "I know I'm dead, Sarah." The voice came again, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. "But I remember everything. I remember the hands that pushed me. I remember the face that smiled while I fell. I remember the lies that followed." The temperature in the study began to drop noticeably. Their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began to form on the windows despite the Louisiana heat outside. "Show yourself," Judge Woodruff commanded, though his voice shook with terror. "If you're really there, show yourself." The oil painting of Chloe above the fireplace began to move, not the frame, but the image itself. The painted child's eyes began to track their movement, and her innocent smile slowly transformed into something far more sinister. "I died because I learned the truth," the voice continued, growing stronger. "I died because I found out about the slave ships, about the illegal cargo, about the blood money that built this house." Judge Woodruff's face went ashen. "You couldn't have known about that. You were just a child. I was 17, Papa, old enough to read, old enough to understand what those ledgers in your safe really meant, old enough to know that innocent people were dying because of your greed." The room began to shake, as if the very foundations of the mansion were responding to the ghostly presence. Books fell from shelves, and the crystal decanters on the side table began to rattle violently. "Stop this!" Judge Woodruff shouted. "You're dead! You have no power here!" "Death has given me more power than life ever did," Chloe's voice replied, now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Death has shown me who my real enemies were. Death has given me the ability to seek justice." Suddenly, the ghostly figure of a young woman materialized at the top of the staircase, visible through the study's open doorway. She appeared exactly as she had in life, 17 years old, with flowing golden hair and wearing the white silk dress she had died in. But this was no peaceful spirit. Her neck was bent at an unnatural angle, and her eyes burned with otherworldly fire. "My God," Sarah breathed. "Chloe." The spirit began to descend the stairs, her feet never quite touching the steps. As she moved, dark stains appeared on the hardwood floor, stains that looked suspiciously like blood. "I trusted you, Papa," Chloe said, her voice now carrying the weight of infinite sadness. "I came to you with what I had discovered. I thought you would do the right thing. I thought you would stop the killing. I had no choice," Judge Woodruff whispered. "The business, the family name, everything would have been destroyed, so you had me destroyed instead," Chloe replied, her form becoming more solid as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "You had your own daughter murdered to protect your secrets." "I didn't kill you," Judge Woodruff protested. "I would never hurt you." "No, you didn't push me yourself," Chloe said, moving closer to the study entrance. "But you gave the order. You told him to make sure I could never tell anyone what I knew." "Who?" Sarah demanded, though she was backing away from the approaching spirit. "Who killed you, Chloe?" The ghostly figure turned to face her sister, and for a moment the supernatural fire in her eyes flickered with genuine love. "Someone we trusted, someone who had access to the house, someone who knew Papa's secrets and was willing to kill to protect them." "Tell us," Judge Woodruff said, his voice breaking. "Tell us who did this to you." "All will be revealed," Chloe said, her form beginning to fade. "But first, the guilty must face their crimes. The truth must be spoken. Justice must be served." As she vanished, the room returned to normal temperature, but the dark stains on the floor remained. The oil painting had returned to its original state, showing only the innocent child Chloe had once been. "Papa," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "What did she mean about slave ships? What illegal cargo?" Judge Woodruff couldn't meet his daughter's eyes. We'll discuss this later. Right now we need to figure out who killed your sister." But even as he spoke, he knew that Chloe's ghost would not rest until all the truth was revealed, including the secrets that had led to her death. The curse of Myrtle's plantation had begun, and it would not end until justice was served. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind through the Spanish moss sounded like the whispers of the dead. In the distance, a child's laughter echoed through the swamps, but it was no longer innocent. It was the sound of a murdered daughter seeking vengeance from beyond the grave. The truth would come out one way or another, and when it did, the real horror would begin. Dawn broke over Myrtle's plantation like a reluctant witness, casting long shadows across the Spanish moss-draped grounds. Judge David Bradford Woodruff had not slept a single moment since his daughter's ghostly manifestation, and his haggard appearance showed the weight of his torment. In the grand dining room, the surviving family members gathered for what had become a tense daily ritual. Mary Octavia, the judge's wife, sat rigid in her chair, her once beautiful face now marked by grief and growing suspicion. Sarah picked at her breakfast, her eyes constantly darting toward the staircase where Chloe's spirit had appeared. "The servants are leaving," Mary announced, her voice hollow. 3 more packed their belongings during the night. They say the house is cursed. Perhaps it is, Judge Woodruff muttered, staring at his untouched plate. "Perhaps we deserve whatever torment awaits us." Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the plantation grounds. Through the tall windows, they could see a well-dressed man on horseback, followed by a carriage bearing the seal of a New Orleans merchant house. Who could that be? Sarah wondered aloud. The butler, one of the few servants who had remained, appeared in the doorway. "Sir, there's a Mr. Beaumont here to see you. He says it's about Miss Chloe's business dealings. Judge Woodruff's face went pale. Beaumont, I don't know any Beaumont. He insists it's urgent, sir. Says he has documents that belong to Miss Chloe. The judge's hands began to tremble. Send him in. Moments later, a distinguished gentleman in his 50s entered the dining room. He wore expensive clothes and carried himself with the bearing of a successful merchant, but his eyes held a calculating coldness that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Judge Woodruff, he said, offering a slight bow. I am Clarence Beaumont, owner of Beaumont Shipping. I believe we have much to discuss. I'm afraid I don't understand, the judge replied, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. What business could you have had with my daughter? Beaumont smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Your daughter was quite the clever young woman, Judge. Perhaps too clever for her own good. He reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a bundle of documents. She came to my offices 6 weeks ago, asking questions about certain shipping manifests. She seemed particularly interested in cargo that didn't match the official records. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah and Mary exchanged worried glances as Judge Woodruff's face grew even paler. I don't know what you're talking about, the judge said. Don't you? Beaumont spread the documents across the dining table. These are copies of shipping records from my company. Records that show regular cargo runs between New Orleans and certain African ports. Cargo that was never officially reported to the authorities. That's impossible, Judge Woodruff said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Beaumont's smile grew more predatory. Your daughter was quite thorough in her investigation. She even spoke to some of the dock workers who handled the special cargo. They told her interesting stories about human cargo that was never supposed to exist. The implications hung in the air like a death sentence. The illegal slave trade had been outlawed for years, but Judge Woodruff's business dealings had clearly extended into far darker territory than anyone had imagined. Papa, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Is this true? Were you involved in slave smuggling? Before Judge Woodruff could answer, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the dining room. But this time, it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the walls themselves, surrounding them with its hollow, accusatory tone. Tell them, Papa. Chloe's voice drifted through the air. Tell them about the ships. Tell them about the children who died in the cargo holds. Tell them about the blood money that paid for Sarah's dresses and Mama's jewelry. Beaumont's eyes widened as the ghostly voice filled the room. Extraordinary, he breathed. The rumors about this place were true. Mr. Beaumont, Chloe's voice continued, now taking on a more solid form as her spirit materialized beside the dining table. You were there that night, weren't you? The night I died. The merchant's confident demeanor cracked. I don't know what you're talking about. You knew I had discovered the truth about the slave ships. You knew I planned to expose the whole operation. You couldn't let that happen, could you? As Chloe's ghostly form became more solid, the dark stains that had appeared on the floor began to spread. The scent of magnolia blossoms filled the air, quickly followed by something far more sinister. The smell of death and decay. You killed her, Judge Woodruff said suddenly, the pieces falling into place. You murdered my daughter to protect our business. I protected both of us, Beaumont snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping. She was going to destroy everything we'd built. Do you have any idea how much money we've made from those cargo runs? Blood money, Chloe said, her voice now carrying the weight of infinite sadness. Built on the suffering of innocent people. Built on the bones of children who died in the darkness of your cargo holds. They were just slaves, Beaumont said dismissively. Property, nothing more. They were human beings, Chloe replied, her form beginning to pulse with otherworldly energy. And their deaths cry out for justice just as mine does. The room began to shake violently. Dishes fell from the table, and the crystal chandelier above them swayed dangerously. Mary and Sarah huddled together in terror as the supernatural manifestation grew stronger. Tell them how you killed me, Chloe demanded, her ghostly form now towering over the trembling merchant. Tell them how you waited in the shadows at the top of the stairs. I had no choice, Beaumont stammered. You were going to ruin everything. The authorities would have shut down the operation, seized our assets, thrown us in prison. So you pushed a 17-year-old girl down the stairs, Sarah said. her voice filled with horror and rage. "You murdered an innocent child." "She wasn't innocent," Beaumont protested. "She was a threat. She had documents, witnesses, evidence that would have destroyed us all." "I was trying to save lives," Chloe said, her voice now echoing with supernatural power. "I was trying to stop the killing, and you murdered me for it." The ghostly figure raised her hand, and suddenly Beaumont was lifted from his chair by an invisible force. He dangled in the air, his feet kicking frantically as spectral hands closed around his throat. "Please," he gasped. "I'll confess. I'll tell the authorities everything." "Confessions won't bring back the dead," Chloe replied. "But justice is something I can provide." "Stop," Judge Woodruff shouted, rising from his chair. "Chloe, please, if you kill him, you'll be no better than he is." The ghostly figure paused, her burning eyes turning to her father. "You're right, Papa. I won't become a murderer like him, but I won't let him escape justice either." She released Beaumont, who crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. As he struggled to breathe, dark marks appeared on his neck, marks that looked suspiciously like handprints. "You will confess," Chloe said, her voice now carrying the authority of the grave. "You will tell the authorities everything, every ship, every cargo run, every death, and you will face the consequences of your crimes." "And if I refuse?" Beaumont wheezed. "Then you'll join me in death," Chloe replied simply. "And trust me, Mr. Beaumont, death is far more terrifying when you're guilty of murder." As her ghostly form began to fade, the room returned to normal. But the dark stains on the floor remained, and the scent of death lingered in the air. "Papa," Sarah said, her voice filled with disgust. "How could you be involved in something so horrible?" Judge Woodruff couldn't meet his daughter's eyes. I told myself we were just moving cargo. I didn't want to know what was really happening." "But you did know," Mary said, her voice hollow. "You knew, and you let it continue. You let our daughter die to protect your profits." "I didn't know he was going to kill her," Judge Woodruff protested. "I thought he was just going to talk to her, convince her to keep quiet." "You ordered my death," came Chloe's voice, though her form remained invisible. "You may not have pushed me yourself, but you gave the order. You chose money over your own daughter's life." The weight of guilt settled over the room like a shroud. Beaumont struggled to his feet, his face pale and his neck still bearing the ghostly handprints. I'll go to the authorities," he said. "I'll confess everything. Just please keep that thing away from me." "That thing is my daughter," Judge Woodruff said, his voice breaking. "And she's right. We all deserve whatever punishment awaits us." As Beaumont fled the plantation, the Woodruff family was left to contemplate the full horror of their situation. Their business empire had been built on blood and suffering, and their daughter had died trying to stop it. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind through the Spanish moss carried the sound of weeping, not just from one ghostly child, but from all the innocent souls who had died to fuel the Woodruff family's greed. The curse of Myrtle's plantation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The Louisiana courtroom was packed to capacity as the trial of Clarence Beaumont began. News of the slave smuggling operation had spread like wildfire through New Orleans society, and the revelation that Judge Woodruff's own daughter had been murdered to cover up the crimes had shocked the entire state. Judge Woodruff sat in the witness gallery, his once proud bearing now broken by the weight of his guilt. Beside him, Sarah and Mary maintained their composure, though their eyes held the haunted look of people who had seen too much. Beaumont, seated at the defendant's table, looked nothing like the confident merchant who had visited Myrtle's plantation. The dark handprints on his neck had never faded, serving as a permanent reminder of his encounter with Chloe's ghost. His lawyer, a nervous man named Morrison, shuffled through his papers with trembling hands. "The court calls Captain Jeremiah Hayes to the stand," announced the prosecutor, a stern man named District Attorney Caldwell. A weathered sea captain in his 60s approached the witness box. His face was deeply lined by years of sun and salt water, and his hands showed the calluses of a lifetime working ship's rigging. But his eyes held a haunted quality that suggested he had seen things no man should witness. "Captain Hayes," Caldwell began, "you were employed by Beaumont Shipping for how long?" "Near on 15 years, Hayes replied, his voice rough from decades of shouting orders over ocean winds. "Though I wish I'd never taken the job." Tell the court about the special cargo runs you conducted for Mr. Beaumont." Hayes looked directly at Beaumont, his eyes filled with disgust. They weren't cargo runs. They were slave runs, illegal ones. We'd sail to the West African coast, take on human cargo and bring them back to Louisiana. How many such runs did you conduct? Too many to count. Maybe 50, 60 over the years. Each time we'd load up with men, women, and children who'd been captured inland, pack them into the hold like animals. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Woodruff closed his eyes, unable to bear the testimony. "What were the conditions like during these voyages?" Caldwell continued. Hayes's voice broke slightly. "Hellish. We'd chain them in the cargo hold, packed so tight they could barely move. No proper ventilation, barely enough food and water. Disease would spread through them like wildfire." "How many typically survived the voyage?" "On a good run, maybe 70%. On a bad run," Hayes shook his head, "sometimes less than half would make it alive." "What happened to those who died during the voyage?" "We'd throw them overboard, weighted down so they'd sink. Sometimes we'd have to throw a dozen bodies over the side in a single day." The gallery was silent, except for the sound of Mary Woodruff quietly weeping. Sarah held her mother's hand, her own face pale with horror. "Captain Hayes," Caldwell said, "did you ever express concerns about these operations to Mr. Beaumont?" "Many times. But he always said the same thing, that we were just moving cargo, and if some of it spoiled during transport, that was just the cost of doing business." "Did you ever consider refusing to participate?" Hayes looked down at his hands. "I was in debt to Beaumont, deep debt. He owned my ship, my crew, my livelihood. He made it clear that if I refused, I'd end up in debtor's prison, or worse." "Tell the court about the night of Miss Chloe Woodruff's death." Hayes's face went even paler. "I was at Beaumont's warehouse that night, going over manifests for the next voyage. Around 10 o'clock, a young lady came in. Beautiful girl, couldn't have been more than 17 or 18. Did you recognize her?" "Not at first. But when she introduced herself as Judge Woodruff's daughter, I knew we were in trouble." "What did she want?" "She had a ledger with her. Started asking questions about shipping manifests that didn't match the official records. She knew about the slave runs, knew about the deaths. She even had testimony from some of the dock workers." "What was Mr. Beaumont's reaction?" Hayes glanced at Beaumont, who was staring at the table in front of him. He was furious. Started pacing around, muttering about how she was going to ruin everything. Said she could destroy both him and her father. "What happened next?" "She said she was going to the authorities the next morning. Said she couldn't let the killing continue. That's when Beaumont lost his mind." "In what way?" "He grabbed her by the arm, said she wasn't going anywhere, started threatening her, saying he'd make sure she never left the plantation alive." The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing, hanging on every word. "Did Miss Woodruff respond to these threats?" "She told him she wasn't afraid of him, said her father would protect her if he knew what Beaumont was planning. That's when he laughed and told her that her father was the one who'd ordered him to handle the problem." Judge Woodruff stood up suddenly, his face contorted with anguish. "That's not true, I never—" "Judge Woodruff," the presiding judge called out, "you will remain seated and silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Hayes continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Beaumont told her that her father cared more about his business than his daughter's life, that he'd given explicit orders to do whatever was necessary to keep her quiet. What happened after that?" She started crying. Said she couldn't believe her father would betray her like that. Beaumont saw his chance and grabbed her. Said he was going to take her back to the plantation and solve the problem once and for all. "Did you attempt to intervene?" Hayes hung his head in shame. "I should have. God forgive me, I should have. But I was a coward. I let him drag her out of that warehouse." "What happened next?" "I followed them to the plantation. Beaumont had a key. Apparently he'd been given access by the judge for their business meetings. He took her inside through the back entrance. And then I waited outside. About an hour later, I heard screaming. Then I heard her fall." The courtroom erupted in gasps and cries of horror. Several women in the gallery began weeping openly. "What did you do after you heard her fall?" "I ran. Like the coward I am, I ran. But I could hear Beaumont inside, arranging things to make it look like an accident. moving furniture, wiping down surfaces. "Captain Hayes, why are you testifying today? Why now?" Hayes looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "Because she's been visiting me every night since she died, standing at the foot of my bed, asking me why I didn't save her. I can't sleep, can't eat, can't live with what I've done." As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the courtroom began to drop. Several people in the gallery pulled their coats tighter as their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. "She's here," Hayes whispered, his eyes fixed on a point behind the judge's bench. "She's here right now." The ghostly figure of Chloe Woodruff began to materialize at the back of the courtroom. She appeared exactly as she had in life. 17 years old, beautiful, wearing the white dress she had died in, but her neck was bent at an unnatural angle, and her eyes burned with otherworldly fire. The courtroom erupted in pandemonium. Several people fled toward the exits, while others sat frozen in terror. The bailiffs reached for their weapons, though they had no idea what to do with them. "Order! Order in the court!" the judge shouted, banging his gavel repeatedly. Chloe's ghostly form moved slowly down the center aisle, her eyes fixed on Beaumont. As she walked, dark stains appeared on the floor in her wake, stains that looked suspiciously like blood. "Thank you, Captain Hayes," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos. "Thank you for finally telling the truth." Beaumont cowered in his chair, his face white with terror. "Keep her away from me. I'll confess. I'll tell you everything." "Yes, you will," Chloe replied, her form now standing directly in front of the defendant's table. "You'll tell them how you murdered me. You'll tell them how you pushed me down those stairs. You'll tell them how you smiled while I died." I did it," Beaumont sobbed. "I killed her. I pushed her down the stairs. But it was the judge who ordered it. He told me to do whatever was necessary." "He may have given the order," Chloe said, her voice now carrying the weight of infinite sadness. "But you were the one who chose to murder a child. You were the one who chose money over human life." The ghostly figure turned to face her father, who was weeping openly in the gallery. "Papa, I loved you. I trusted you. I thought you would do the right thing when I told you what I'd discovered. I never thought you would have me killed." "I didn't know," Judge Woodruff cried out. "I swear I didn't know he was going to kill you." "You knew I was a threat to your business," Chloe replied. "You knew I had evidence that could destroy you, and you chose to protect your profits instead of your daughter." As her ghostly form began to fade, the courtroom slowly returned to normal temperature. But the impact of her appearance would be felt for years to come. "The defendant will be remanded into custody," the judge announced. "This court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Judge Woodruff remained seated, staring at the spot where his daughter's ghost had stood. The full weight of his crimes was finally settling on his shoulders, and he knew that no earthly justice could ever absolve him of what he had done. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind carried the sound of weeping, not just from one ghostly child, but from all the innocent souls who had died to fuel the greed of men like Beaumont and Woodruff. The curse of Myrtle's plantation was spreading, and it would not be satisfied until every last debt was paid. The execution of Clarence Beaumont took place on a gray October morning in 1796, just as the Louisiana autumn was painting the Spanish moss with shades of gold and crimson. A crowd had gathered in the town square of New Orleans, but the atmosphere was somber rather than celebratory. The revelation of the slave smuggling operation had shaken the community to its core. Judge David Bradford Woodruff stood among the spectators, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. In the months since the trial, he had aged decades. His wife Mary had suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was now confined to a private sanitarium in Charleston. Only Sarah remained at his side, though their relationship had been forever changed by the terrible truths that had been revealed. As the noose was placed around Beaumont's neck, the condemned man's eyes frantically searched the crowd until they found Judge Woodruff. Even from a distance, the judge could see the accusation in those eyes, the unspoken reminder that Beaumont was not the only guilty party. "Any last words?" the executioner asked. Beaumont's voice carried clearly across the square. "I die for the murder of Chloe Woodruff, but I was not the only one responsible. Her blood is on the hands of everyone who profited from our enterprise. May God have mercy on all our souls." The trapdoor opened, and Clarence Beaumont's life ended with a sickening snap. But as his body swayed in the morning breeze, several witnesses swore they saw a young woman in white standing beside the gallows, a woman who looked exactly like the ghostly figure that had appeared at the trial. Judge Woodruff felt a chill run down his spine. Even in death, Beaumont's execution had not brought him peace. If anything, the weight of his guilt had only grown heavier. After the execution, Judge Woodruff and Sarah made the long journey back to Myrtle's plantation. The great house stood empty except for a skeleton crew of servants who had proven too loyal, or too afraid, to leave. The other slaves had been freed and given passage to the north, part of Judge Woodruff's desperate attempt to atone for his sins. That evening, as father and daughter sat in the dining room where so many terrible truths had been revealed, the familiar sounds began again. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, followed by the soft patter of feet on the stairs. "She's coming," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The temperature in the room began to drop, and the scent of magnolia blossoms filled the air. Chloe's ghostly form materialized slowly, but this time she was not alone. Behind her came the spirits of others, men, women, and children of various ages, all bearing the marks of violent death. "Justice has been served for my murder," Chloe said, her voice carrying the weight of infinite sadness. "But what about justice for them?" She gestured to the spirits behind her, and Judge Woodruff's blood ran cold as he recognized what they represented. These were the victims of the slave trade he had helped finance, the souls of those who had died in the cargo holds of Beaumont's ships. "How many died, Papa?" Chloe asked. "How many souls were lost so that you could live in luxury?" Judge Woodruff couldn't speak. The magnitude of his crimes was overwhelming. He had always told himself that he was just a businessman, that he never personally harmed anyone. But faced with the spirits of his victims, he could no longer maintain that self-deception. 347, said one of the spirits, a middle-aged African man whose body bore the marks of chains. "That's how many of us died during the crossings. 347 souls whose only crime was being captured and sold into slavery. And that's just the ones who died at sea," added another spirit, a young woman clutching a ghostly infant to her chest. "It doesn't count the ones who died from disease and mistreatment after we arrived. It doesn't count the families torn apart, the children sold away from their parents." Sarah began to weep as the full scope of her family's crimes became clear. "Papa, how could you be part of something so horrible?" I didn't know," Judge Woodruff whispered. "I thought I was just investing in shipping ventures. I didn't want to know the details." "But you did know," Chloe said, her form becoming more solid. "You knew exactly what kind of cargo those ships were carrying. You knew people were dying, and you chose to look the other way because the profits were too good to refuse." "I tried to tell you," she continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "I came to you with the evidence, hoping you would do the right thing. I believed in you, Papa. I believed you were a good man who had made a mistake. I am sorry," Judge Woodruff said, his voice barely audible. "I am so deeply sorry for what I've done, for what I allowed to happen." "Sorry doesn't bring back the dead," said the spirit of a young boy, no more than 10 years old. "Sorry doesn't erase the pain of dying alone in the darkness of a ship's hold, calling out for a mother who was already dead." The ghostly figures began to move closer, surrounding Judge Woodruff and Sarah. The temperature in the room continued to drop, and frost began to form on the windows despite the mild Louisiana evening. "What should we do with him?" asked one of the spirits. "He profited from our suffering. He grew rich from our blood. He had his own daughter murdered to protect his wealth," added another. "What mercy does such a man deserve?" Judge Woodruff fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of his sins. "I don't deserve mercy. I deserve whatever punishment you see fit." "Papa, no," Chloe said, her ghostly form kneeling beside him. "I didn't return from the dead to become a killer. I returned to ensure that the truth was known, that justice was served." She turned to face the other spirits. "Beaumont paid for his crimes with his life. Papa will face earthly justice for his role in the slave trade, but more importantly, the truth is now known. The operation has been exposed. No more innocent souls will die because of their greed." "Is that enough?" asked the spirit of the middle-aged man. "Is earthly justice sufficient for crimes against humanity?" "It has to be," Chloe replied. "If we become killers ourselves, we become no better than those who wronged us." Justice, not vengeance, is what we seek. The other spirits began to fade one by one until only Chloe remained. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the plantation grounds where so much blood had been spilled. "This place will never be the same," she said. "The stains of what happened here will never wash away. But perhaps it can serve as a reminder, a warning to others about the price of choosing profit over human life." "What will happen to us?" Sarah asked. "What will happen to our family? You will live with the consequences of Papa's choices," Chloe replied. "The plantation will be seized by the authorities. The family fortune will be confiscated to pay reparations to the families of the victims. You will face social ostracism and financial ruin." "And you?" Judge Woodruff asked. "Will you finally find peace?" Chloe's ghostly form smiled sadly. "I will find rest, Papa, not peace. That may take centuries, but I will rest knowing that the truth has been told, that justice has been served, and that no more innocent blood will be spilled because of the choices you made." As she began to fade, the room slowly returned to normal temperature, but the dark stains on the floor remained, permanent markers of the terrible events that had transpired within these walls. "Remember me," Chloe's voice echoed as she vanished. "Remember all of us. Remember that every choice has consequences, and that some sins cast shadows that reach far beyond the grave." Judge Woodruff and Sarah were left alone in the empty dining room, surrounded by the ghosts of their past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Outside, the wind through the Spanish moss carried the sound of weeping, not the angry cries of vengeful spirits, but the mournful lament of souls, finally at rest. The curse of Myrtle's plantation was beginning to lift, but its lessons would remain forever etched in the history of the house and the memories of all who heard its tale. 25 years had passed since the night Chloe Woodruff returned from the dead to expose the truth about her murder. The year was 1821, and Myrtle's plantation had changed hands several times, each owner driven away by the ghostly presence that seemed to inhabit every corner of the great house. The current owner, a northern businessman named William Ashford, had purchased the property at auction. Drawn by its grand architecture and sprawling grounds, he had been warned about the plantation's reputation, but as a man of science and reason, he dismissed the stories as Southern superstition. On this particular October evening, Ashford was entertaining guests in the very dining room where so many terrible truths had been revealed decades earlier. His wife, Margaret, a delicate woman from Boston, sat beside him, while their young daughter, Emily, played quietly in the corner. "Tell us about the ghost stories," said one of the guests, a journalist from New Orleans named Harrison Blake. "The locals claim this place is haunted by the spirit of a murdered child." Ashford laughed dismissively. "Nonsense. I've lived here for 6 months and haven't seen so much as a shadow out of place." The previous owners were simply too susceptible to local folklore. "But surely you've heard the stories about Judge Woodruff and his daughter," Blake pressed. "The slave smuggling operation, the murder, the trial that shocked all of Louisiana." "Historical facts, certainly," Ashford replied. "But ghosts? Supernatural manifestations? I'm afraid I'm too rational a man to believe in such things." As if summoned by his skepticism, the temperature in the room began to drop. The guests pulled their coats tighter as their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. "William," Margaret said, her voice trembling, "something's wrong. Emily, come away from that corner." But their daughter remained where she was, staring at something the adults couldn't see. "There's a pretty lady here, Mama. She's wearing a white dress and she looks sad." The adults turned to look, and slowly, the ghostly figure of Chloe Woodruff began to materialize. She appeared exactly as she had in life. 17 years old, beautiful, but with her neck bent at an unnatural angle, and her eyes holding the weight of infinite sorrow. "Hello, Emily," Chloe said, her voice gentle and kind. "Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you." The child smiled and took a step toward the spirit. "Are you the lady who lives in the house?" "I am," Chloe replied. "I've been waiting here for a very long time." "Waiting for what?" Emily asked, her childish innocence unafraid of the supernatural presence. "For someone to remember, for someone to understand, for someone to learn from the mistakes of the past." Blake, the journalist, had recovered from his initial shock and was now scribbling frantically in his notebook. "Extraordinary," he breathed. "The stories were true. You really are the ghost of Chloe Woodruff." "I am," Chloe confirmed, her form becoming more solid. I am the daughter who was murdered by those who should have protected her. I am the child who died because she tried to do the right thing. What happened to your father? Blake asked. To Judge Woodruff? He faced earthly justice for his crimes, Chloe replied. He was stripped of his wealth, his position, his reputation. He spent his final years in poverty and disgrace, haunted by the knowledge of what he had done. And your sister Sarah? She devoted her life to helping others. She used what little money remained to establish schools for freed slaves to provide medical care for the poor. She never married, never had children of her own. She died at the age of 43, worn out by her attempts to atone for our family's sins. Ashford, who had been standing in stunned silence, finally found his voice. If justice was served, if your family paid for their crimes, why do you remain? Why haven't you found peace? Chloe's ghostly form moved to the window, looking out at the plantation grounds where so much blood had been spilled. Because the lessons of the past are easily forgotten. Because new generations of men make the same choices my father made, choosing profit over human life, wealth over moral duty. I remain as a guardian, she continued. A reminder that every choice has consequences, that some sins cast shadows that reach far beyond the grave. A guardian? Margaret asked. You protect this place? I protect the truth, Chloe replied. I ensure that the story of what happened here is never forgotten. I watch over the innocent and warn against the corruption of greed. Emily, who had been listening intently, walked closer to the ghostly figure. Are you lonely? Chloe's expression softened with infinite sadness. Yes, child. I am very lonely. But loneliness is a small price to pay for ensuring that other children don't suffer as I did. What about the other spirits? Blake asked. The victims of the slave trade. Are they still here? They found rest when the truth was revealed, Chloe said. They were able to move on, knowing that justice had been served. But I cannot rest as long as there are those who would repeat the mistakes of the past. Will you ever find peace? Emily asked, her young voice filled with compassion. Perhaps, Chloe replied. When mankind learns to choose love over greed, compassion over profit, truth over convenience, when children like you grow up to be better than the adults who came before them. As she spoke, the ghostly figure began to fade, but her voice remained strong. Remember this place. Remember what happened here. Remember that every choice matters, and that the innocent should always be protected. I will wait here as long as I must, she continued. I will guard this truth until the end of time if necessary, for I am Chloe Woodruff, and I will not let the world forget. As she vanished, the room returned to normal temperature, but the impact of her appearance would be felt for years to come. Blake would write about his encounter, ensuring that Chloe's story was preserved for future generations. The Ashford family would become devoted caretakers of the plantation, maintaining it as a memorial to the victims of greed and corruption. And through it all, Chloe would remain, a gentle guardian spirit watching over the innocent and ensuring that the lessons of the past were never forgotten. Visitors to Myrtle's plantation would continue to report sightings of a young woman in white, standing at the windows or walking the halls. Children especially seemed drawn to her, and many would claim to have spoken with the kind lady who told them stories about the importance of doing the right thing. The curse of Myrtle's plantation had evolved into something else entirely. Not a malevolent haunting, but an eternal vigil. A reminder that some spirits refuse to rest until justice is served and truth is preserved. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the greatest peace Chloe could find was in knowing that her story would live on, that her sacrifice would continue to teach future generations about the importance of choosing good over evil, truth over lies, and love over greed. The Spanish moss still sways in the Louisiana breeze, and the old plantation house still stands as a testament to the power of truth and the enduring nature of love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light is just right, visitors can still see her, a young woman in white, standing at the window, watching over the world with eyes that hold the wisdom of the ages. Chloe Woodruff had found her purpose, even in death, and in that purpose, she had found a kind of peace that transcended the grave itself. Remember me. Her voice still echoes through the halls of Myrtle's plantation. Remember the truth. Remember that every choice matters, and that the innocent must always be protected, and the world remembers thanks to the eternal vigil of a daughter who refused to let injustice triumph over truth, even in death.